Hello, NAS 4983. This is the second of two Module 2 lecture videos. This second one being about stages of language loss. If you haven't watched the first one about language loss in general, I recommend you go watch that first, come back, and then we'll talk about the stages of language loss. I also recommend that you at least attempt to read the reading in the reading resources, Fishman chapter 4, How Threatened is Threatened. This really covers a lot of that. And so if you didn't understand it after you read it, you can watch this and go back and try to read it again. But we're going to talk about an actual scale or stages of language loss. Okay, so before we get into the actual scale and the stages of language loss, I wanted to talk about language planning. So the theme of one of our future modules is going to be language planning. And just very briefly, what that is an organized agenda or a plan for a language and language use. So this can be a lot of things. It can include language maintenance. What do we need to keep our language healthy and strong? Language revitalization. What do we need to do to increase the use of our language? This could be actual policies and laws. What does our government need to do to ensure the rights of our speakers or to promote the use of our language? It could be creating a new vocabulary or standardizing vocabulary or spelling. So the actual corpus or body of the language. How do we want our language to be spelled? How do we want this particular word to be spelled? It could include the reputation or people's feelings about the language. What do we want people to think about, or how do we want people to feel about our language? And then it could also be evaluation. So what is the current state of our language? How many first language speakers exist? How many second language speakers? How many people are learning? How many people in our community have taken a class? Things like this. So the reason I bring up language planning is because it plays into the different levels of language loss. So Fishman talks about languages as being threatened. And so according to Fishman, Joshua Fishman, the linguist who wrote the article, threatened languages are languages that are not replacing themselves demographically, i.e. they have fewer and fewer generation after generation, and the uses to which these languages are commonly put are not only few, but additionally, they are typically unrelated to higher social status, prestige, and power, even within their own ethno-cultural community. So let's break this down. This quote from Fishman down. So threatened languages, which we often talk about as an endangered language, but he's talking about them as threatened, are one, not replacing themselves. So they have fewer and fewer users generation after generation. And the uses of these languages are few. So you can't talk about every single thing in the world in these languages. And they are the uses of the language, or the use of the language is not associated with high social status, and he says prestige and power, even within their own community. So that's a lot to take in. It's about numbers. It's about the ways in which you can use the language, like how you can use it, and then how people feel about using it. And it's not often considered the best, prestige and powerful, even within their own community. So there's kind of like three big parts to what is a threatened language. And from this definition, he's created a scale, kind of like a Richter scale, where every level gets like a magnitude worse, to kind of place threatened languages on the scale to see where they are. Okay, so these are some points of contention. So some things that you should keep in mind. So Fishman says that everyone must be a part of revitalization efforts. It can't just be like the language department or like the people at church. It's got to be everybody. Much of language revitalization things can be implemented without compulsion. So he says, everyone's got to be a part of it. In reality, you can do a lot of these things without everybody being a part of it. And honestly, you're never going to get everybody on board. They also say if we give special rights to minority languages, then national languages lose out, and then it's not fair. So this is not true. Minority language rights do not interfere with majority rights. So if you give funding to tribes to revitalize their language as like the federal government, that is not going to suddenly make English an endangered language. It is not. If you provide, if a tribe is able to provide special training for their teachers to be able to teach the language, a teacher of French in a high school is not going to be missing out because this, indigenous language teacher receives special training. It doesn't work like that. So some people believe and that bilingualism will hurt the majority language. And the opposite, people believe, if you allow your kids to even watch TV and hear English, they're never going to learn the language, the indigenous language, the minority language. Both of these are untrue. Bilingualism does not hurt anyone. Bilingualism is a benefit for everybody. So you can still have English in your home and have the endangered language that you're trying to learn, and vice versa. You can have this endangered language in your home and still, be perfectly fluent and able to live in English as well. So learning languages does not hurt anybody. And then there's this misconception that you have to mirror the revitalization efforts and plans that worked in other areas. So, for example, the Hawaiian language nests have been extremely effective in creating young speakers. Absolutely, that worked well for the Maori, and it worked great for Hawaiians as well. That is not going to work for everybody, and there's a lot of reasons why. So just because something was extremely effective in one area of the world and in one community, that does not mean that it's going to work for everybody. And so revitalization efforts have to vary and change due to the unique problems faced and the opportunities encountered. Another example, the Hawaiians have done a great job of doing language revitalization with incarcerated people, and it has really reduced the rates of recidivism, going back to jail, for these incarcerated people, because they have a new sense of identity and pride in themselves and their culture and their language, and it's been great. I would love to see a program like that here especially in Oklahoma. However, with Hawaiian people, they are all speaking the same language. They're all speaking very similar dialects of the same language and have a shared cultural history. With Native Americans in Oklahoma, there are so many different languages and so many different cultures that it may not be as an effective method because it's not going to be the same for everyone. And so just because something works in one area doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone else. Just because the Cherokee have a really good immersion school does not mean that immersion school is going to work well for people. Immersion schools have not worked great for the Irish, and they've had them for decades. And as soon as kids get out of school, they stop using the language. So things are not going to be the same for every group. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about this scale, this kind of scale on seeing how threatened, how endangered is a language. So the name of the scale is the Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale. So graded, we have different levels. Intergenerational, that's like we talked about before, passing the language from one generation to the next. disruption. Obviously, it's getting disrupted, and then it's a scale to tell us. Okay, so we can call this GIDS, GIDS. We don't have to say graded intergenerational disruption scale, and I probably never will again. And think of it like a Richter scale, where every number gets higher on the level, and at each level things get more and more severe, a magnitude severe. Every level you go up. Okay, there are 8 stages, so 0 and 1 being like everything's great, whereas 8 is like the worst. And then the higher the number, the worse things get. Okay, so we're going to start at the top and work our way down, because we're talking about endangered. Okay, so here we are at the GIDS stage 8. So this is the definition from the article of what this stage is. Most vestigial users of X-ish, and so Fishman uses X-ish as a generic word for a language, like French, Spanish, Cherokee, whatever. He's not saying the language, he's saying X-ish as whatever language. Insert any language here. So most vestigial users of X-ish are socially isolated old folks, and X-ish needs to be reassembled from their mouths and memories and taught to demographically unconcentrated adults. So let's break this down. Vestigial users of this language are, whatever is left, the remaining few users of these language, and the people that know, and they may not be fluent, they may not remember a lot of things, but these are the last folks that spoke this language. They're socially isolated, so they don't have a community of speakers around them. They're old folks, and the language has to be reassembled from their mouths. So maybe they don't remember a lot of things. Maybe they don't have clear speech, because old folks, as you lose teeth and other things, it becomes harder to pronounce. And sometimes their memories become jumbled of like how they used to use different things or how stories went. And then the language they have has to be kind of reconstructive and then taught to demographically unconcentrated adults. So that's any adults, not the generation directly below them, but any adults that will be able to learn it. These older people can't be teaching children or other things just because they have so little of the language. So let's talk about some of the features of this level. And again, remember 8 is like the last stage. So they have an advanced degree of attrition, which just means a high level of loss. The speakers are scattered, so they're often in rural, isolated communities. They're not together. Speakers may be deficient in the language of everyday life. They may not remember how to talk about certain things, like everyday life kind of things. Maybe they just remember prayers, or they remember certain phrases. Speakers often know more of the language than they realize, and they can be triggered to remember more through just talking with them, emotional, humorous expressions, memories, and stories. I have personally seen this with people that I have worked with. There is an elder speaker of a language that I've worked with many times and recorded her, and she has told us before that she couldn't remember certain words, and so the director of the language program has been able to give her words, and she'll pronounce them for us. And but then just in chatting with her while the recorder was going, thankfully, she was able to tell us a whole story and about a related kind of subject. We were talking about Northeast, Southwest, and she was really having a hard time remembering one of the directions, and she said it just didn't seem right to her. And then she was able to give us a whole story, about from her childhood, and talking about going in a certain direction and how that tied into a story. So things that she had never shared before, because just chatting and talking kind of triggered those memories. And then this is a really discouraging, kind of depressing stage. This is kind of the I don't want to say the end of a language, but definitely the end of a era for a language, when these last who had been fluent speakers at one time are in their twilight. Okay, so now we're going down. We're getting a little less severe with every stage. So get stage 7. This is the definition from the article. Most users of X are socially integrated and ethno-linguistically active population, but they are beyond childbearing age. So what does this mean? So the users of the language are socially integrated. So that means they're not isolated. They have children and grandchildren around them. And they are able to use the language, ethno-linguistically active population, but these people are not going to be having children. They are beyond, they're maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They can use the language, but they will not have any small children in their home, except for maybe grandchildren. These are the oldest generation of speakers still alive. This generation of speakers are also older, and they may even be elderly, but able to actively teach younger generations that are able to have their own children. So whereas with stage 8, the people were so elderly that they wouldn't be able to have the time or the patience or the ability to be able to teach language. These people theoretically could be able to teach the language, if not to children, then to adults that have children. And then many people in this generation understand more of the language than they use or they speak. So maybe they can't recall how to say certain things, but if you say certain things to them, they will understand it, and that will prompt their memories. All right, so now we're moving on to stage 6. And again, remember, it gets a little bit better with each stage. So the definition from the article is the attainment of intergenerational informal oracy. So this is spoken language. And it's demographic concentration and institutional reinforcement. Okay, so let's talk about this. We have the attainment of generational informal oracy. So there are multiple generations of the language speakers that can talk to each other. Maybe they can't read, maybe they can't write the language, but there are more than one generation, because it's intergenerational, of people who can, at least in informal ways, hi, how are you doing? Pass me some water. Go to bed, things like this. They can have informal conversations with each other. And it's demographic concentration and institutional reinforcement. So there is definitely a generation that has more speaker than the other. And these could, again, be older speakers. But the institution, the government, the tribe, the whoever the governing part or the institutional of this language group is for the language. They are reinforcing it. They encourage people to use it. So the reappearance of intergenerational family. So here we're talking about the core stage of this is family. We have grandma, we have mom, and we have kids in the same family that can use varying levels of the language. It is an informal spoken language, primarily of the home, between generations. So it is, again, being an informal spoken language. Maybe you don't have a lot of materials written in the language. It's definitely maybe not the language that kids are being educated in school in, but it is being used in the home between generations of the family. It can definitely be the language of daily life. So this could be, best case scenario that you go to school in one language and you come home and use this language. Outside forces, usually the dominant society and language must not be allowed to infiltrate. So if you have a good enough use of the language that you're able to use it as your language of daily life, then you really don't want the dominant society language coming in and replacing it as the language of daily life. All right, so now we move to stage 5. Remember, things are getting better at every stage. So X, literacy in the home, school, and community, but without taking on extra communal reinforcement such as literacy. So you're able to use X language in your home. You're able to use it in your school. You're able to use it in your wider community. But it doesn't necessarily have, so it talks about this extra communal reinforcement of such literacy. It's not a national language, right? So you're able to read and most likely write in your house, in your school, in your local area, but this is not the language of TV. It is not the language that you see your government use. It is not a formal language of your country or your area. So here, the main goal is to protect the oral use of this language and promote literacy. So you want people, it's already being used spoken a lot, so you want to protect that and make sure it's continued to be spoken. And you want to increase and promote literacy in this language. So you want to make sure that there's lots of books and it's something that you see on TV, and that your government recognizes that providing resources in this language is good. Next thing is you want to increase the prestige of this language with more materials. Like I said, more written and spoken materials. You want to see TV shows made in this language. You want to have music in this language. You want to have books in this language. Most likely, you'll have to fight with the government or work with the government for more funding for materials in this language. So here, the language is being used a lot on the local levels. Definitely in the home, totally in the school, definitely in the community, but it is not at the national level on the same level of whatever the national language is. So here you're just trying to protect it. You're going to increase the prestige, like have more and more materials in your language, and you're going to try to get your government to recognize the importance of your language, your national government. Okay, so now we're moving to stage 4. X is used in lower education. It says types A and B that meets the requirements of compulsory education laws. So you are guaranteed education in your language, and so lower education being primary school and high school. So this is the types A and B, primary school and high school. And it meets the requirements of all education laws. So if you were getting educated in your threatened language, you're getting the same quality education as someone who's being educated in the majority language. And so this would be things like having preschool, Head Start, elementary education in the language. This could be bilingual or monolingual. So bilingual, majority and minority language, or it could be just in the minority language. Here you're going to need teachers certified to meet the compulsory education laws, but are also able to teach about subjects outside of the X language. So what I mean by this, why? So let's give the example of, let's say, English and, I don't know, Choctaw. Okay, so Choctaw is obviously the threatened language, whereas English is the dominant language. And say you had gotten to a point in stage 4 where state of Oklahoma has laws that say that you can receive your education in English or in Choctaw. And then you're able to go, you have the right, not only able to, but you have the right, they have to provide education for both elementary and high school in Choctaw if you choose it. So you have your preschool, Head Start, elementary education in Choctaw. This could have been bilingual, where you do Choctaw, and then do English and Choctaw and English throughout the day. Or it could have been all in Choctaw. You'll have to have teachers who meet the English laws, so teachers who are certified teachers in English, but also know enough Choctaw to be able to teach these subjects in Choctaw. And this requires a lot of cooperation with the government. So you're going to need, a lot of work on getting curriculum approved, things like that. Now, when we talk about these stages, you must have met all the other stages to get to this stage. So even though I use Choctaw as an example, just because a language has, say, a immersion school that meets these requirements, that does not mean they're at GID stage 4. They must have met all the other stages behind it. They're at stage whatever and happen to have features of stage 4 as well. So to be at stage 4, you must also be having literacy in the home and school and community. You must also have intergenerational oracy. You must also have integrated and ethno-linguistically active population. All of these must be met to be able to be at this. You can be at a higher stage that has features of a lower stage, if that makes sense. Okay, so stage 3, the use of X in the lower work sphere outside of the X neighborhood or community, involving interaction between X people and Y people. So what this makes me think of is so being able to use X in the workspace outside of a X neighborhood or community. So being able to, let's just use an example. So if you were working in construction, there might be languages that the workers in construction use that is outside of English, and you're still having interactions with English speakers, and you're still able to use that. So an example in Ireland, so you have guaranteed education in Irish, and you can either go to a immersion school where you mostly study Irish, or you can, no matter what, even if you don't go to an immersion school, you are required, it is required to take Irish language classes every single year from elementary all the way through high school, and to be able to graduate, you have to take an Irish kind of like exam, final, to be able to pass and actually graduate from high school. And so there are lots of people in Ireland that know different levels of the Irish language. Whether or not they use that in their home spheres or not is very debatable to certain degrees. I'm sure that it happens, but to other degrees it doesn't. And then, so let's say you wanted to use Irish in the work sphere. So maybe you had a shop, maybe you worked at a restaurant, something like that. And so even though the majority of people around you in just like everyday life would be using English, if you were able to work and get by using Irish, then you would be at this stage right here. So X has control of certain industries and allows for extended use of X in the work sphere. So what that means is the minority language has enough speakers that in certain workplaces and certain industries, it allows for extended use in what they do. And then that also means that there is a economic base for this endangered language in their community. That there is a economic reason why people can use this language, because they know they can work and have a certain career in this language. X can be used among the people who speak it and used for company records while still serving people who speak the Y or majority language in Y-ish. So can you imagine a situation in the future where the endangered language you speak, and let's say, I don't know, Chickasaw, can be used with Chickasaw people and in business for company records, for just talking with people at work, for interacting, and still serving English speakers and people who use English. So it's a much more bilingual and cooperative stage here when you start bringing in economics. So stage 2, and remember these stages get more and more optimistic as you go through them. So EXISH, or the endangered language, is used in lower governmental services and mass media, but not in the higher spheres of either. So for example, you are able to get government services like welfare, Medicaid, other things in your endangered language. It is seen on TV or in music, but the other language is definitely there as well. And then the most prestigious parts of your government, so maybe like how Congress works, or whatever your system is, or like the national news, things like that, are in the dominant language. It's very rare to get to this level. That means that the indigenous language or the endangered language must take on a very central and influential role, and kind of fight against the powers of the more dominant language. And here Fishman talks about a brain drain being a possibility, that the dominant language steals ideas and cultural materials and other things from the endangered culture and people. And I didn't finish my sentence here, but X must, so the endangered population is constantly having to work against this. Okay, so stage 1, you're pretty much not endangered if you're at stage 1. So there is some use of the endangered language in higher education. So we're talking about going to college. Occupational, so being like the CEO of a company. In government, so maybe like your representatives and other people, judges and things in the government, speak your language. And media, but without the additional safety provided by political independence. So you have a lot of representation of your language in your community, but you do not have the exact same political independence. You're still colonized. You're still under this other set. So stage 1 represents the end of a long journey, but it's not the end of language problems. Often multilingualism is politicized. And so we talked about English only. We talked about if you love your family, speak Catalan, things like that. Some users of the endangered language will be upset that they have to share status with another language, a colonial language. We have, fluent speakers at every level. You can go to a school at every level in your language. Our language is represented in the government. Why is this other language still here? Why? Why is it even still here? Modernization of the endangered language will require constant changes. You got to create new vocabulary. You have to be open to talking about things from other cultures. And this can lead to resentment by some speakers. And the endangered language is still at risk, and advocates must constantly continue to advocate for it, because the fact is, if there's a smaller number of speakers, eventually a language with a dominant more speakers can infiltrate in. Okay, so here's the stages at a glance, 1 through 8. And so there's a stage A and stage B. So you got state-funded public schools, or schools funded by just the community. And this is kind of like the breakdown of the different stages. So X, stage 1, X is present in education, work, mass media, government. At a national level, X is in the local mass media and government services. X is in the local regional work sphere, X-men and Y-men. So for both speakers of the minority language and the majority language, you got state-funded schools. You got funded by the community schools. You have extracurricular for adults and children to achieve literacy. At stage 6, you have oral intergenerational transmission acquired in the home or in a neighborhood setting. Stage 7, you have cultural interactions in the community, but mostly among older people. And then stage 8, The only speakers or users of the language are extremely elderly, and the language would need to be reassembled from their knowledge in order to be taught to other people, because they cannot directly teach it, or they don't have enough to teach it. So this is kind of like the simple breakdown of this scale. Okay, so why is this important? Well, by being able to create these categories, these stages, you can kind of gauge where an endangered language is and what it needs to do to come back to, to increase, to revitalize. And so the very first couple slides talked about language planning. So the first thing you do when you do language planning, and we'll talk about this in a future module, is you have to know where you are to know where you're going to go. And so it is definitely not good to dwell on these things or to constantly, see where you are in comparison to other languages. But it is important to know what stage your language is at if you're working with the language, where you'll go if nothing is done, and the kind of things you can work on to increase the use of your language. This is by no means the most important part of language revitalization, but it gives us a place to look at and to think of, if our ultimate goal is fluency for all members of a particular cultural group in their endangered language, what kind of things need to happen to get there, and in what stages does it make sense to do it. So if, say, your language community is at a 7, then you understand to get to a stage 6, we need to make sure that the language is being transmitted and acquired in the home in different generations. And then once we're there, then we know that we can have these extra classes, for adults and children, so that we can gain a lot of literacy in our language, so that we're not just speaking the language, but we're able to read and write the language to truly become fluent. And then we know that we need schools funded by our community. Then we'll work towards getting the government to fund schools for our community, etc., etc. And then, we'll make sure that you're able to work and receive government services to push up those stages. Okay, so this is the second of 2 Module 2 lecture videos. If you tried to read the Fishman video article and it didn't make sense, go back and try again now. All right.